Hello, everybody. Uh, Welcome to this webinar of the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. I'm Ricardo Contreras, and I am going to introduce the presentation with the help of my colleague, Juliana Barabas from IIQM. So first of all, thank you all of you for coming today. We have today a presentation by Drs. Catherine Demarais and Catherine Ralston, who will be presenting Exploring the Archives for Qualitative Research Studies. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, and while the guest speakers are presenting, your microphones will remain muted. However, if you have questions to ask, feel free to do so by writing down your questions in the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can take a look at that control panel now and maybe write something like hi, and I will be able to read that. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go over those questions and I'm going to read them out loud. And if anybody would like to speak, I will offer the microphone to those people. It would be nice to have a nice dialogue. Now, if you speak, if you have the microphone, I would like to ask you to start by introducing yourself, saying something about where you come from, and then ask your question. So the presentation in total will last 60 minutes. As I said, 40 minutes for the actual presentation, and then the remaining for questions and answers. About 3 hours after the presentation is over, you are going to receive an automated message with the video of this webinar. If you do not receive it, please check your spam folder, because it could end up there. Okay. So with that, I would like to ask my colleague Juliana from IIQM to say a few introductory words for the presenters.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. It is Juliana speaking from Edmonton, Alberta. And thank you, as always, to Atlas TI for their ongoing work on these masterclass series webinars. Our two presenters, the first of which is Kathleen Demarais. She is a professor in the Department of Lifelong Education, Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia. With a background in sociology and anthropology of education, she serves as a qualitative methodologist in UGA's qualitative research program. She has a long history of teaching qualitative research method courses and mentoring doctoral students. Her research focuses on qualitative methodologies, critical qualitative research, qualitative pedagogy, and the teaching of qualitative research methodologies. A key research strand includes the history and funding of conservative philanthropists in the United States and their impact on educational policy and practice. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, her books include Foundations for Research, Methods of Inquiry in Education and the Social Sciences, with S. Lapan, Inside Stories, Educating Young Adolescent Girls, that with P. O'Reilly and B. Penn. The Way Schools Work, A Sociological Analysis of Schooling, with M. Lecomte. Life at the Margins, Profiles of Diverse Adults, with J. Merrifield, D. Hempfield, and B. Bingham. Teach for American Counter Narratives, Alumni Speak Up and Speak Out, with T.J. Brewer. Her latest co-authored book, Philanthropy, Hidden Strategies and Collective Resistance, A Primer for Concerned Educators, was published in 2019 with T. Jamieson Brewer, B. Heron, J. Atkinson, and J. Lewis. Catherine Ralston is a professor in the Department of Lifelong Education, Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. She is currently the program coordinator for the Qualitative Research Program at UGA, where she teaches and conducts research on qualitative methodology. Her research interests include qualitative research methods, qualitative interviewing, analysis of talk and interaction, and teaching qualitative research methods. She is the author of Reflective Interviewing, A Guide to Theory and Practice from 2010. In addition to journal articles, has contributed chapters to The Sage Handbook of Interview Research, The Complexity of the Craft from 2012, The Sage Handbook of Qualitative Data Analysis, The Sage Handbook of Data Collection. Her most recent edited book is Interactional Studies of Qualitative Research and Interviews in 2019. Catherine and Kathleen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now give you the control of the session so that you can show your PowerPoint. Okay, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Go ahead now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kathleen DeMarais.
And I'm Dr. Kathy Ralston.
This is a photo of rabbits sunning themselves outside their warren. Hidden underneath is a complex web of tunnels and burrows. For those of you who aren't familiar with rabbits, they live in connected burrows called a warren. They are maze-like places. You might think of them as labyrinths, catacombs, or webs that you and I might easily become lost in. I'm sure the rabbits know their ways around. I have found working with the archives, it is very much like this, a maze where one thing leads to another and another, and you might even find yourself in what feels quite far from the original reason you looked into the topic in the first place. What caught your interest at the beginning led to something quite different and perhaps even more fascinating later. You just never know where you're going to end up or where the journey into the archives may take you. My experience of the archives has been just that. I start at one point, often get lost in the process of discovery, and eventually come to a topic or research question developed through this interesting exploration. This deviates from the more typical approach we use to qualitative research design that you might be more familiar with. In this presentation, our purpose is to give you an introduction into using archival collections from the perspective of qualitative researchers. We begin with a few definitions, followed by a statement of principles created by the Society of American Archivists. We then turn to a discussion of the rules of archival institutions, as well as the ways we can use the archives to identify a topic of interest. We then address the importance of working with the archivists. We share stories of our own projects, as well as examples of ways qualitative researchers have used archives in their work.
This is Kathy here. What do we mean by archives? Archival collections exist all over the world in universities, government institutions, and local communities. Archives contain all manner of written, auditory, and visual items. Here, we've listed some of the items that you might find in archives. There are rare books, manuscripts, and documents, and those are probably what we think of first when we think of archives. But you will also find multimedia, video and audio. You'll find maps. You'll find moving and still images. You'll find ephemera. So these are fleeting examples that typically we might not collect or keep, but these might be political buttons, stickers, or advertising posters. You'll find textiles and costumes, artifacts such as cameras, video collections, or musical instruments. Universities frequently house their archival materials in larger configurations called special collections. For example, here at the University of Georgia, where we work, the Special Collections libraries consist of 3 large groupings. The Hargret Library houses rare books and manuscripts, which include letters, diaries, research records, maps, and other written documents. The Brown Media Archive houses audio and video collections, as well as artifacts pertaining to audio-visual media such as vintage broadcast microphones. The third collection is named after a Georgia senator, Richard B. Russell, and houses items to do with Georgia's political history, as well as several digital oral history collections. Much of the special collections here at the University of Georgia pertains to the history of Georgia, and you will find that special collections typically prioritize collecting items to do with particular themes or topics. On this slide, you see information about the background or provenance of an artwork. Provenance refers to the record of ownership of a collection and includes information concerning who created an item or collection. In other words, where has the item or collection come from, where has it been? The provenance of any collection is recorded in the archive's finding aid, which provides a written description of what is in a collection. Let's look a bit further at how archivists organize and arrange the materials in a repository. Here you see a list of principles used by the Society of American Archivists to organize materials. For those of you who are outside the United States, you might look at the Association for Archivists in your country and compare what you see here. First, archives possess unique characteristics, and archivists decide what to save and how to describe and organize materials according to some common characteristics. Second, this means that when archivists assemble a collection, the original order of the items is preserved. This is known as respect des fonds. Third, archivists sometimes determine how a collection might be arranged if there is not an original grouping. Fourth, archival repositories describe the multi-level structure of a collection as well as the individual parts. In a moment, I will share an example of a finding aid so you can see what this looks like. Fifth and sixth, finding aids, which are the descriptions of collections, are developed for all items in an archive, regardless of the media or source. Seventh, because finding aids vary in level of detail, sometimes it's not possible to know what is contained in a collection unless you visit the archives and look at each item. This is where surprises can occur, when you find things that you didn't expect. And finally, finding aids also include a description of who created the materials, that is, the original source of the archive and how it was donated. That is what is meant by provenance, as you saw on the previous slide. Here is an example of a finding aid from one collection that I've examined. I've located this collection by using the term Federal Writers Project, since I know that this collection contains notebooks related to this particular project. You'll see that the size of this collection is indicated by the number of boxes. Here, it's 2 1/2 boxes. This is also expressed in linear feet. In this case, this collection takes up 1 foot of shelf space. Very large archives speak of literal kilometers of shelving. As one example, the archives at the Vatican boast of having 85 kilometers of shelving with 600 fonds, and a fond is the entire body of a record of an organization, family, or individual. Back to this finding aid from the Grace McCoon papers, you can see that this has a collection number. It's MS1478. This is the number needed to request this material for review, and you would select the particular box as well that you wanted to look at. Further down, you will see a short history of the person who created the documents. In this case, Grace McCoon was a field worker who lived in Athens, Georgia, where I live, who worked for the Federal Writers Project, which was a work relief program initiated in the United States in the Depression years of the 1930s. On this slide, you can see a continuation of the finding aid. This finding aid provides further description for the index terms used for this collection, as well as a note for each folder in each box. The index terms provide a way to search for related materials in the repository in which this collection is stored. One, for example, could follow up to locate other forms of data. I could choose notebooks, as well as a particular project of which these notebooks form a part. For example, the Georgia Writers Project. So any of those index terms, if I were interested, I could search through the large repository to see what else was there. This collection is ordered chronologically and provides no information as to what materials are in Box 1, Folder 1, other than that they were created from March to April 1938. The only way to learn more about the documents in this collection is to request the boxes and look inside.
Kathleen here again. Rules and regulations are indeed intended to ensure the safety and security of the archives. Typically, patrons are not allowed to take paper, pens, food, or drinks into a reading room, and there may be prohibitions on the type of clothing worn. Archives typically have sets of lockers where patrons can store their belongings. Every archive is different, and each archive will lay out particular rules patrons must follow in order to review materials. Some will require gloves to examine some types of archives and others will not. For example, at the National Archives, patrons are able to handle most documents without gloves. The archivists we've worked with believe working without gloves is safer since we have more dexterity in our fingers and are less likely to tear fragile pages. However, in the photograph room at the National Archives where I was working, disposable gloves in various sizes are provided to handle the photos to keep oils away from the collections. So even within an archive, depending on the types of materials, you'll want to be aware of the procedures for handling these materials. This is an image of what is called a pull slip from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. In order to access materials, you need to provide as much information from the finding aids that Kathy mentioned as possible. The slip is then given to the archivist who will retrieve those materials from a temperature-controlled vault. At some archives, pulls, as they're called, are done at certain times of the day, so it's necessary to plan carefully so you have materials available throughout the day to review. When the materials are delivered, they arrive on carts containing boxes. At some archives, materials are kept off-site and cannot be accessed for a day or more. This is another reason to do plenty of research and pre-planning prior to your trip to the archives. Here's a photo of boxes containing folders of documents. You can see how carefully these boxes are labeled with their contents. Typically, there are rules governing where the archival boxes are to be placed in the reading room, how many boxes can be on the table at one time, and how to keep track of where each folder in the box goes so it can be replaced correctly. Archives will typically give patrons a slip they put when they take a folder out so they know where to put it back. In most of the collections we've been to, only one box at a time can be placed on your work table. The rest stay on the cart and you work through them carefully one at a time. Archivists will watch patrons to ensure that they are following all the rules. These rules may be as specific as not removing any pins from fragile documents or maintaining an item from a certain distance from the edge of a table. Rules and regulations are typically published on an institution's website, and before visiting an archive, it's important for you to review these so that you know what the rules are for that particular archive. We have both taken different paths to exploring the archives. For example, Kathleen, I teach a qualitative research course in narratives and have also taken numbers of fiction writing courses to better learn that genre. I have an interest in creating narratives based on historic documents. In my community, we've had a living history event where actors perform as historic characters. I wrote many of these living history scripts based on materials I've accessed in archival collections. I then became interested in learning more about a great uncle, Thomas Evan Walker. When my nephew wanted to name his second child after this person, I wanted to learn more about him. I had heard stories about him going to World War I, but I didn't know much more than that. There were no documents from family members and few stories about him. So I began with digital archives and found a collection of World War I soldiers killed in the war in the New Jersey Digital Archives. Here is a photo of the card for Thomas with his military information I found while searching the digital New Jersey State website. I then purchased a copy of the full record. As you can see, there's Thomas Evans' picture on the record. Each card gives a short account of the soldier, his division and regiment, overseas assignment, and date of death. I was surprised to see attached to this record a letter sent to the state from his brother. The letter reported that Thomas was the only soldier who died in World War I from his hometown in Penns Grove, New Jersey, and his memory lives on through an American Legion post named after him. I followed this trail to the National Archives and visited the College Park, Maryland archives, where an extensive collection of military records is held. I found that Thomas was part of the American Expeditionary Forces on the Western Front in France. Working with the military archivists there, I was able to locate weekly field records that traced the company's whereabouts from the time he enlisted until he was no longer with the company. This is an image of the packet of field records I examined. Note how fragile they are. I found photographs, maps, and narratives of other soldiers describing experiences at the front. When I couldn't find his death and burial records, the archivist directed me to another archive in St. Louis, where I was able to locate extensive records of his burial in France. Although some of those records had been burned in one of the archives, there was enough that they were able to send me the pieces that remained. Here is an image of one of the monthly field records. As you can see at the bottom of this record, it details the movement of the company from Halifax across the ocean on the SS Mesaba, arriving in Liverpool, England, and then after a brief rest camp in Southampton, on to Le Havre, France, and a few days later to Vitry on the western front of the war. Notice the image of the ship that transported the company to England. Here is a photo of a list of soldiers who earned 1 gold service chevron for 6 months of service on foreign soil. I was excited to see Thomas Evan Walker on this record, and you can look down at the right and about 2/3 of the way down, and you can see this record. I also learned through this document that he had been promoted from private to corporal. As a related collection, I found a series of narratives written by officers who fought in the same area in France. Near the end of the war, these officers were instructed to write personal narratives of their experiences and were specifically asked to include emotions in their accounts. I was very surprised at the extent to which the Army went to document the war with narratives like this, as well as thousands of photographs. This is a photograph from the Military Archives World War I collection showing the many soldiers whose bodies were transported back to the U.S. for reburial at the request of their families. This last record is a card of Thomas Evan Walker's death and burial in France. When I was visiting France, I traveled to the American History Museums and cemeteries on the Western Front to gain a better sense of the places referred to in the documents that I had looked at. While this is a very sad story of one World War I soldier, it tells the story and the daily lives of many of those who served in France during the war. I am still gathering archival data that I'll use to create a full narrative of Thomas Evan Walker, not only for my family, but for the local community and historical organization near his hometown.
Hello, it's Kathy again. I began by examining a specific type of data. Because one of my research interests is that of interview methods, I started by looking at collections of interviews across the 3 collections in our local special collections library that I talked about earlier. I began exploring video and audio recorded interview collections in the Brown Media Archive. Because some of these had been archived on media that is no longer used, in some cases I had to request that materials be digitized before I could listen to or view the recordings, and that probably sometimes takes up to several weeks to get done. I was able to examine, for example, some television interviews conducted by journalists that have been donated by a television station in Atlanta. I also then began looking at videoed interviews of President Richard Nixon that were conducted by a former employee and trusted friend, Frank Gannon. And you see Frank Gannon here from a video interviewing President Nixon after he had resigned. I was able to compare the way President Nixon responded to interview questions posed by Gannon with more adversarial questions posed by David Frost, whose interviews with Nixon resulted not only in a much-watched television program, but a stage play, a book, and a film. And you probably may have seen the film or even the television program because they are very widely available. And sometimes I just came across curious items that I didn't anticipate. So while I was looking at Frank Gannon's interviews with President Nixon, an archivist located a documentary that had been made in the 1990s called The Eye of the Storm. The filmmakers collaborated with John Ehrlichman, who was White House counsel on domestic affairs to President Richard Nixon, to tell the story of what was going on in the White House during the Watergate scandal. And the archives included the administrative records to do with the filmmaking, including letters to potential interview participants. So here you see an extract from a letter to Frank Gannon from John Ehrlichman seeking an interview to discuss the president's state of mind after his resignation. And what's interesting about this collection is it was donated by a bank. The film was never directly released to the public, and then at some point a bank found all of these archival records to do with the making of the film in their collection, and then that's how it came to be in the local special collection. So each collection has a story that goes with it as to how it came to be part of a larger repository. As I explored various interview collections, I eventually came across written narratives recorded by workers from the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. Now, these were part of the Works Progress Administration project, which were aimed at helping people in the United States during the Depression years. What impressed me about this collection was its sheer size. How, I wondered, had federal administrators worked with state directors to provide instructions to the thousands of field workers to conduct life history interviews with thousands of people. I was hooked by this project. I began to search for administrative documents and located more in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, as well as examining materials archived from this project in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Here you can see on the left a file folder at the Library of Congress in Washington containing one of the life history interviews conducted by Grace McCoon, who I showed you the finding aid from her notebooks earlier. So she was a field worker in Athens, Georgia, and her materials, some of them you will find also in the Library of Congress, and some of these have been digitized as well. Of course, it's also easy to get really distracted when visiting an archive since there are so many other records to look at. So on the right, you see one of the numerous archival boxes that come from the papers of anthropologist Margaret Mead. These are housed in the Library of Congress, and I spent several hours perusing some of the boxes from that collection because I teach research methods. That was very fascinating. In the example of the Federal Writers Project that I've just provided, though, I quickly discovered that there was voluminous materials archived across the country. So how does one gain a better sense of a collection? Liz Stanley's chapter in her co-authored book, The Archive Project, Archival Research in the Social Sciences, provides some useful steps to guide anyone's practice. This book is a great resource for anyone wanting to explore the archives. So first, you can search for what exists. So in the case of the Federal Writers Project, materials existed across the country in state archives as well as in the National Archives in Washington and Maryland. Second, I began to search for secondary literature to locate books and articles written by scholars about the Federal Writers Project. As I gained more knowledge, I became interested in the former slave project in particular. This was one project within the larger Federal Writers Project. For example, I read Catherine Stewart's book, Long Past Slavery, Representing Race in the Federal Writers Project. This provided informative background to the project that Stewart had distilled from her searches of multiple archival collections. Third, I was able to explore finding aids at other institutions, such as the Library of Congress, online. This may not be possible for all collections, but it's always useful to survey what has been made available online before you visit an archive, since some archives digitize the actual items within any particular smaller unit, such as a folder. In the case of the former slave project, the Library of Congress has digitized over 2,000 narratives collected across the country during the 1930s of people who had been born into slavery. And so anyone can review these online. They've also included some of the administrative records from that project. So through a combination of online review of digitized materials, as well as review of actual documents in archival collections in Georgia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., I was able to gain a better sense of what was available. Sometimes my searches led me to dead ends. For example, I found a collection of materials from one of the Georgia state directors involved with the Federal Writers Project, but there was a complete absence of mention of his involvement in this project. As I learned from secondary sources, some professional writers were reluctant to be associated with this project, even after many years, since it was much critiqued both while being conducted and after the materials had been made available to others. So once you have located a specific collection to focus on, what questions can you ask? Again, I found Liz Stanley's guiding questions for mapping a collection very helpful. For any collection examined, you might look at the boundaries and ask what is included and excluded, just as I mentioned in the previous slide, the state director who didn't include any information in his materials to do with the Federal Writers Project. So this entails working systematically through a collection to develop a sense of the overall themes and concerns that emerge. For example, as another example, I was interested in learning more about the field workers who were involved in the Federal Writers Project. So when I came across Grace McCoon papers that I talked about earlier, I was really excited about that. But when I looked at the actual documents, there were no personal accounts that she had included there. So her collection just included the working notes and narratives that she had generated during her employment with the Federal Writers Project. As you move through a collection, you need to give thought to what information you should record. This can be rather overwhelming, but you have to think about what would be useful to take notes, or should I enter information into a database? And this is especially the case if you've traveled to another state to examine archival materials. All of the archival collections that we have visited have allowed us to take in a laptop or tablet and a cell phone into the reading room. So we've been able to take notes, and sometimes we've taken photographs of documents. I just want to emphasize that it's really important to be very systematic about keeping records of what you examined, and then also keeping information about where particular items are located. Once you've left the archives, you won't remember this. So you could include information about the box, the file, and the collection numbers. And sometimes we found it very helpful to photograph the information on the front of the boxes that we have looked at. And you've seen in earlier slides what that looks like. Finally, for each folder, box, and collection examined, you need to make decisions as to whether these are relevant to your developing topic of interest. Then you'll have to ask yourself, what should I do next?
This is Kathleen again. Lindsay Pryor asked very helpful questions here when using documents in research. I find these particularly relevant to working with the archives. It is critical here to look at the archives within the context of its times, who created it, and for what purpose. How did it function? What were the politics around the documents? How were they taken up or consumed within that context? Documents and archives need these types of critical questions from the researcher. For those working with documents, whether it's within the archives or not, Pryor's book, Using Documents in Social Research, is an excellent resource. Building a good relationship with archivists is essential. As we noted before, archivists may have particular disciplinary specialties, as in the case of the military archivist I worked with, or may be knowledgeable about a particular collection and can guide you into archives you didn't even know existed. As in my case, an archivist directed me into another collection across the country. After identifying a collection of interest, get in touch with the archivist before you visit the archive. They will be able to pull archives and have them ready for when you arrive. You may be able to discuss the collection with the archivist before or during your visit or after. Sometimes you can create a relationship that goes on throughout the project itself. We've both found working with archivists extremely helpful in moving our projects forward.
This is Kathy again. There are just numerous examples of topics that researchers have explored using archival collections. So I'm just going to talk about two. In an article published in Qualitative Inquiry, Ian Shaw explores using concepts from Michel Foucault's work, and as many of you know, Foucault made extensive use of archives in his work. Shaw examines the history of social work research methods at the University of Chicago. Shaw selected the University of Chicago as a site for research since it housed the first fully university-based social work program in the United States. The founders of the program kept comprehensive archival records of the program's development. Shaw's research was initially guided by a puzzle that he explains as, and I quote, a disruption between sociology and social work which was brought to a settlement with the alleged sidelining of social work in 1920 into a professional graduate school, unquote. When Shaw began to examine records in the special collections at the University of Chicago, he found it, and I'm quoting again, extraordinarily difficult to connect this account of social work and sociology's genealogy to the primary texts, unquote. Shaw goes on to explain his own understandings of how various objects, statements, and themes in social work research practices at Chicago in the 1920s and 30s came to be deployed to generate an understanding of the relationships between social work and sociology. I'll let you read further about what Shaw found in his archival wanderings, which he described as akin to the artist Paul Clay's description of drawing as, quote, taking a line for a walk, unquote. In my own article, which you see listed second here, I examined what might be learned about interview methods from the former slave project, which, as I've mentioned earlier, was one of the projects conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project. My interest here was on examining methodological questions. For example, what might be learned from archival records concerning how the workers conducted interviews and represented those to others? What might be learned from past practices that can inform contemporary researchers who use interviews? Because the Federal Writers Project is so large, it literally has thousands of interviews, I focused on what I could learn from records pertaining to Georgia. This entailed examining original records from the state records that had been archived here at the University of Georgia, as well as visiting the National Archives in Maryland and the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And this project also entailed a lot of examination of secondary literature. We have found that there's just literally no end to the topics that you could explore via archives and special collections. And I just want to mention that there has also been over, I would say at least 20 years now, increasing interest in archiving records from qualitative research projects. Louise Corti, who directed the QualiData Archive in the United Kingdom, has written extensively on this topic. And on this slide, you'll see two of her articles, but she has written much more on this as well. The QualiData Archive is now administered by what is known as the UK Data Service, and this group provides digitized data sets for research and teaching purposes. So you can go onto the UK Data Service's website and sign up to be able to access archived qualitative research projects. So Corti suggests 6 approaches to making use of archived data from qualitative research projects. These are to develop descriptive studies, to undertake comparative, follow-up or restudies of prior topics, to reanalyze or conduct secondary analysis of data sets, to examine studies with a view to exploring methodological issues. So that's the approach I took with the Federal Writers Project data that I was mentioned earlier. You can also verify findings from earlier studies, and then you can also use data for teaching purposes. And we have both used our projects for teaching purposes and have also developed courses for qualitative researchers who want to work in the archives. Although there has been a good deal of debate as to the merits and challenges of archiving qualitative research projects, as we've shown earlier in this presentation, these are just one form of collection that you might come across within a repository. And we found, as I mentioned earlier, literally endless supply of potential topics to explore. Coming to a conclusion here, I just want to quote from the French historian Arlette Farge, who talks about working in the archives as alluring. The allure of the archives, she says, entails a roaming voyage through the words of others, and a search for a language that can rescue their relevance. It may also entail a voyage through the words of today, with the perhaps somewhat unreasonable conviction that we write history not just to tell it, but to anchor a departed past to our words and bring about an exchange among the living. We write to enter into an unending conversation about humanity and forgetting, origins and death, about the words each of us uses to enter into the debates that surround us. And I'd just like to note that while Faj isn't a historian, qualitative researchers who work in other disciplines can also make good use of archival sources.
We've been inspired by our visits to the archives, whether it is the National Archives in Washington, D.C., College Park, Maryland, the Library of Congress, or the National Archives closer to home in Atlanta. Here you see on the top left the National Archives in D.C. and the Library of Congress Reading Room on the right. At the bottom left, you see the Reading Room at the National Archives in Atlanta. We hope you will be able to take the time to locate and visit some of the archives available near you. And we'll open it up for any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, both of you. Let me ask all of you, if you have questions, please, you may click on the hand icon next to your names in the GoToWebinar control panel. And in fact, there is the first one here, Genevieve. I'm going to offer you the microphone. Go ahead. You could start, please, by introducing yourself, your name, and where you come from.
Hello, me?
Yes, Genevieve, your hand is raised. Would you like to speak?
Oh, sorry. I must have done that by accident. I was just listening quietly. I'll let somebody else go.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to mute you. And okay, so anybody would like to ask a question? We don't have yet any written questions, but and I'm going to give the microphone to Dorothea. Please go ahead. Could you say, first of all, introduce yourself, your name, and where you come from?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. You know, in our setup, so much historical data is available in oral tradition. You know, many local people, for example, are having archival documents in their homes that haven't been put in, for example, museums or academic libraries. Would this be regarded also equally as significant?
Yes, Dorothea, you have some similar experiences to me. This is Kathleen. I work very closely in my home community, which is Lexington, Georgia, and that's a rural community. Families have lived there for years and years, and they tend to rely on oral histories to pass along the stories. They also maintain records in their homes. They're very hesitant and suspect even of putting their records with archives like we've been talking about today. So I've done a couple of things. I've certainly encouraged the use of the archive, the special collections, for some of the materials that are in our local county courthouse. For example, I was able to examine records from 1790, these inferior court records that are pretty fragile, but they're still in that local courthouse. The other thing I've done is I've had an opportunity to conduct oral history interviews with some of the community members, and that's been very useful in maybe putting some of these things in a written form so that they can be maintained after that person has passed.
Thank you.
Dorothea, where are you located?
In Cape Town, South Africa.
Right, yes.
Thank you very much for coming to this session. We have more questions, and I'm going to offer the microphone to Bridget. Bridget, let me look for your name here. Bridget, I found you, and I will unmute you now. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is Bridget calling from Edmonton, Canada, and I want to thank the presenters, Kathy and Kathleen, and also the organizers. And this is very interesting for me because there is an ongoing work I'm actually trying to do on archival methodology, which is about a certain process of maidenhood practices in my country, Nigeria, and how to follow that through from the historical times. And something occurred to me in the course of discussing this during this presentation. I found out something really important when Kathy mentioned the need to trace records from the archive step by step, sometimes in a sequence that oftentimes you don't have to follow through systematically to kind of start from your research questions to seek out what you want. You can actually take on what is available at the time, and that follows through until you get onto the things that you want in that sequence, in that order, which will actually lead you to the subject. Like when she talked about tracing the subjects from the very beginnings of the stories of World War I until the subjects left the company. And there's something that I wanted to ask about that, which has to do with this particular interest in tracing something systematically. If it doesn't work that way, and then even when you try to trace it on the point of availability, what if you trace it from that availability at that point and some of these archival sources has been lost? Like, for instance, the use of the musical practices in the maidenhood research that I want to do, I found out that some of these things were documented in sources like gramophone records, which has already become outdated and no more, someone cannot resurrect or any of these archival sources anymore. Does that undermine the purpose of the research entirely? Or you can look for other alternatives in maybe interviewing people directly and then using this some of these things like pictures, like some of these aids that has been used in the past, which does not entirely focus on the very musical aspect you want to deal with. Does that take away the aspect that when you're following through something without that systematic process, it's going to undermine the purpose of the research? That's what I want to find out. I don't know if you understand me.
Yes, thank you, Bridget, for your question. You've hit on a really important point in doing archival research.
Yeah.
When you are working with archives, you can only work with what is there. And what is in archives is actually quite haphazard. And sometimes you might want to locate or follow a specific topic, but when you actually look in the archival records, it's not there. So really you have to be flexible and you are following the data. Now, this idea of being systematic, what I want to emphasize here is, as you search through any particular collection, just be really careful about keeping good records of where you've been, what you've looked at. So that's what I mean when I talk about being systematic. But certainly, all archival records are incomplete, and that's one of the fascinating things about doing archival research. You might follow the data to multiple archives, as we've talked about, to get different kinds of materials that relate to one another. So you might, by starting in one archive, you might end up in several more. And I hope that answers your question.
And I wanted to add one thing here, Bridget. Before you have a second or third visit to the archive, it's important to, again, organize your materials and assess where you are, and even start writing the narrative of what you found. Because in writing that narrative, you're going to find what you don't know. And then you can start asking more and more specific questions that you want to find out in the archive when you go back. So there's a lot of pre-work and post-work, and it's just a cyclical process until you finally exhaust any of the archives that you were looking at. You will get to an end to the project.
Another thing, while Kathleen was talking there, Bridget, that I was thinking about is, depending on the topic, some scholars go out and do interviews with people who are living as they relate to a particular topic. Now, of course, if you were dealing with records from the 1800s, that's certainly not going to be possible. But if you were dealing with a collection or a topic where there are still people who are living who might know or provide more information about this topic, you might supplement those archival records by going off to talk to other people about the topic.
Thank you very much. We have at least 4 more questions and we have about 6 minutes left, so the answer should be relatively short. I'm going to offer the microphone to Dr. Ashraf El-Safty, and my apologies if the pronunciation is not correct, and he's joining us from Egypt. So I am going to offer you the microphone now, and you have to click on the microphone icon next to your name. Okay, now it's open. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to the presenters and for the organizers. My name is Ashraf Safti. I'm a teaching professor of research methods in Egypt. Again, thanks for the content and for the journey throughout the session. And my question focuses on the way of linking such informative, let me say, flow of following and exploring the archival data to the research design and the way of analysis. How we can link this with the recommended structure of the methodology within the research design and the data analysis. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, which I think gets at larger issues. So I'm going to refer you to the book that I mentioned, the Archive Project, Archival Research in the Social Sciences. There's 4 authors in this book. They I think are based all in the United Kingdom, but they have done research in multiple countries, including United States, United Kingdom, and South Africa. And they actually have a different theoretical approaches to putting together the research and design and analysis of their data sets. So I don't think there's any one way to go about designing and analyzing data in this work. There's multiple paths.
Does that
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. Now let me see who else is online. Let me see, I have Beatrice, and Beatrice, she asked, do you follow same procedure when reviewing medical records for research purpose?
Yes, I think I would. I want to jump back just quickly, though. We're used to laying out a research question and a research purpose and doing our design from there. This is very, very different. So it really is starting with an archive of interest and then developing the research design as you go along. But I would say with the medical records, yes, we were in the medical records in Atlanta just last week. And it's a matter of systematically going through those records and start looking for the patterns and seeing what you can see. I don't see much different in using those kinds of records.
Thank you. And we have a last one from Shi Song, and I'm going to open your microphone. And again, I apologize if I did not pronounce your name the right way. Your microphone is open now. You have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. My name is Kai Zizhong from the University of Toronto, and I have a little question about the definition of archive research. For example, if I'm looking for a government document from the government website, and some document have been published on different years. For example, what 1919 or 2019, something like that. So if I want to use the document right now in this, I mean in recently, so is that a literature review or is it archival research? So I don't know what is the boundary between the archival research, archive research, or and the literature review. What's the difference, and is there any distinction, or is there any I mean, is there a line that at the time or something? Yes, that is my question. Yes, thank you.
I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're wanting to know what the distinction between records that are available on websites online and records in an archival collection. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so archival collections are ways to preserve documents for succeeding generations. Whereas, as we all know, websites quite often change. And so for a time, any institutions have records available online that we can also use as a form of data. So they are documents, but they may not necessarily end up being archived for preservation for future generations.
Thank you very much. And we have come to the end. And before I close, I would like to thank both of you, of course, for coming today. And I would want to thank as well everybody who joined from, it seems to me, so many different countries. And I would like to ask my colleague Juliana to say a few words, maybe mentioning some of the activities that are coming up at IIQM.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you, Kathleen and Catherine, for that lovely presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. We have another masterclass presentation coming up on November 21st. That's Julianne Scott, Performance, Documentary, and Embodied Qualitative Inquiry at the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. We, of course, have the Qualitative Health Research Conference that starts just next week. So I'm certain we'll be seeing some of you who have attended today there, and look forward to that. And please do watch the IIQM website for both the archive of this webinar and others from earlier this year and any upcoming. Thanks again, Ricardo, Kathleen, and Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for coming. We are now in our 6th or maybe 7th year, I'm losing count, of this webinar series. And the success of the series depends exclusively on you coming and maybe sharing this series with your students and colleagues. It's a very good way to be up to date on qualitative methods. So thank you, Dr. Demarais and Ralston, and Juliana, and everybody who came today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
By the way, you are going to receive the video of this presentation about 3 hours from now. Check your spam folder in case you don't see it. Thank you, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.